bird that had just found its way up there, and Margaret Goodale managed to escort it all the way down the stairs and all the way out the door. But that's what I thought that was for a feather bird.
I see your posts on yeah.
Hey everyone, we're going to get started in about a minute, so I just invite folks to find their seats. Looks like all the working group members are here, so I think we can get started. So please do find your seats, and we're gonna get started very soon.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Everyone have a seat, getting settled in. And it's great to see everyone. I'm Kevin Woodhouse, the city manager for the city of Pacifica. I'm going to make a few just brief introductory comments and then turn it over to Ben from Kearns and West. Before I do that, I want to introduce Mayor John Keener in the back, who's present, and Mayor Pro Tem Sue Vadelas, who's also here as well. So this is an exciting milestone in this process and in this issue that is very critical to Pacifica. And so the first thing I want to do is thank all of you, thank all of the community work group members for the time that they're volunteering. I want to thank members of the public for the time they're taking to be here, as well as throughout this entire process, which will stretch over many months, the thoughtful input that everyone will give into this, because that's critical to this process. I want to talk about two things as we kick this off. I want to talk about passion, and I want to talk about trust. Passion, number one, in my 3.5 months being here in Pacifica, one of the things that I've learned is that there is an incredible level of passion throughout this community. Whatever your special interest is, it just exudes through the community, and that makes this an inspiring as well as complex place to do business and to live. About this issue, there's incredible passion because it's related to sea level rise, it's related to property interests. And my point that I want to make about passion for this process that we're launching into is not asking you to not be passionate. I'm not asking you to set aside that passion, but what's important to this process is to be open-minded and objective as everyone learns and does work. And what you're going to hear tonight from the presentation is an incredible amount of information about the context for this study and more. So passion and open-mindedness are critical in this process. The other part of this is trust, and to work with varied interests on a topic and move the dial forward requires trust, and it requires presuming good intent from everybody who's participating in this. Whether you're on the community work group, whether you're a member of the public, that's critical. And I'll share with you, in my previous job, I represented my agency in a network of 19 organizations related to stewardship efforts in the Santa Cruz Mountains. It was called the Santa Cruz Mountains Stewardship Network. And the organizations that were involved in that were on completely opposite sides of goals. We had timber companies and we had, endangered species protection interests. We had, public access advocates, and we had, scientists that, and environmentalists that wanted to, not allow public access. That network only was able to move forward because of the efforts that were given to building trust amongst the different participants. And there's going to be an icebreaker exercise for the community work group for all of the members up here tonight. And it's important because you need to get to know each other. We have limited time, so that's hard to do, but you could also do that outside of this room. But building that trust is important. So I want to leave you with that. I don't want to take any more time, but thank you, and your passion and open-mindedness is incredibly appreciated, and the goal of trust and the hard work that you're going to put into this to learn is critical to this process. Ben?
Good evening. My name's Ben Gettleman. I work with Kearns & West. Kearns & West is a stakeholder outreach, engagement, and facilitation firm. So we facilitate lots of working group meetings like this. I'm joined by Matt Marvin, who also is with Kearns & West. Matt's going to be taking notes. We'll have a meeting summary of this meeting that'll be available to you all. My job is really to keep us on the agenda, keep us on track, make sure that this conversation is productive and constructive. And so that's what I'm here to do, and hopefully I can help you with that. Where's my clicker? Okay, what I'd like to start by doing is just sort of opening up the meeting here with some introductions, and then we'll walk through the agenda and sort of get into the objectives of the meetings. But what I would like to do is to have the members of the community work group introduce themselves and just briefly your name and what your connection is to Pacifica. Do you live, work here, etc. We're also going to ask the members of the team to introduce themselves, and I think we have time for members of the public to introduce themselves as well. So we just want to know who we all are in the room, then we can get started with the actual agenda and get into the meat of the program. So why don't we start with you, Sam. You all folks have microphones, so I just invite you to share them. Those work. Sorry, you guys don't have any. You can share this one, and then I'll walk this to the back. So.
Hi, I'm Sam Casillas. I've been a resident of Pacifica for now, I think going on like 15 years, down Pedro Point. I've represented many different committees in the past. I was on the Economic Development Committee, FOGFest Committee, the Library Committee a long time ago, and opened the GGRA Board Liaison Committee. Currently, I'm the president of the Pacifica Land Trust, and also I am a board member for the Pedro Point Community Association. And in my spare time, I work as the marketing for biopharmaceutical companies.
Thanks, Sam.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Abbott. I'm a 21-year West Sharp Park resident, and I also work in Pacifica. I'm the executive director at the Sanchez Arts Center. I currently serve as a Parks, Beaches, and Recreation Commissioner, and I'm chair of the Library Advisory Committee and also on the Public Art and Murals Subcommittee.
Hi, I'm Maureen Garcia. I'm a resident of West Fairway Park. That's my status here. I haven't lived in Pacifica for only about 4 years, but I previously had a small business in Berkeley, and I have a lot of experience working with the city as a small business owner.
My name is Tony Boykin. I've served previously on the Economic Development Committee. I'm a business owner in Pacifica. I have a store in the Manor Shopping Center, and I've lived here 40 plus years.
Wow.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's okay.
Hi, my name is Eileen O'Reilly. I'm a 20-year resident of Pacifica. I live in Lindemar. I'm also, I live and work here in Pacifica. I am a business owner, I'm a real estate agent, and I am part of the Pacifica Beach Coalition.
My name is Lindsay Bales. I've been a Pacifica resident in the Lindemar area since 2003. I work for the City of San Jose in their Environmental Services Department. I'm also part of Climate Corps, where we do talk a lot about climate change.
Hi, everybody. My name's Julie Lancel. We've lived here for 32 years, Valamar resident. I've participated in the government here in a variety of ways. I'm currently on the Open Space and Parkland Committee. I've previously served on the City Council. And I find Pacifica basically a really great place to live. And it's the involvement of the community in, so many important decisions that really, for me, makes it a very special place.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leswin Dikuna. I'm a first-time homeowner and resident in Valamar, having lived here for about less than a year. We moved early last year, so just enjoying and exploring the town and the community. For work, I'm a wastewater engineer with CH2M, recently acquired by Jacobs, and I do a lot of planning and design of wastewater infrastructure for a lot of local agencies, having worked for San Francisco, Palo Alto, currently for San Mateo. So again, not directly doing this work, but the sea level rise and climate adaptation topics touch my work. So this is my first community involvement venture for me to learn and contribute. So I'm excited to be a part of the group.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Guzman Garcia. I've been a resident in Pacifica for about 20 years. I'm a former board member of the Pacifica Point HOA. I was its president for a couple of years, and always wanted to participate in something like this, and that's why I'm glad to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Hi, my name is Shalini. I'm fairly new to Pacifica compared to most. I've only been here about 2 years, but I've lived in a coastal town all my life, and I've never seen anything like this happen, so I really wanted to be involved with my background. I've worked on sustainable management plans and conservation strategies, so yeah, and being an avid user of the coastline, I really wanted to be a part of this.
Hi, I'm Jim Steele. I used to be director of San Francisco State Sierra Nevada Field Campus, so I didn't spend much of my time down here. But now since I've retired, I've been trying to do more work. So I'm now president of Friends of San Pedro Valley Park, and I'm a board member of the San Pedro Creek Watershed Coalition. I only speak for myself. I'm not here representing them, so I don't want to get them in any trouble. But, I couldn't ask for a better place to live, so glad to be here.
Hi, good evening. My name is Robin Reneals, and I'm a resident here in West Shore Park since 1976. I've been involved in many different campaigns and issues and causes in order for improvement of the neighborhood. And I served 17 years as a commissioner with the city on the Animal Advisory Commission. And I'm a member of the Pacifica Historical Society. And I'm currently on the board for Pacific Coast Fog Fest.
Wow. I know.
I could follow.
I'm just lost. I'm just going to leave now. Yeah, exactly. Who will check? Gordon Tanura, retired from information technology, and our longtime resident, however, here, 37 or so years of Pacifica. Also currently on the Pacifica Resource Center board.
These mics work.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, hi, my name's Ron Makel, a 45-year resident of Pacifica. Long time. Sometimes it seems like too long, but anyway, that's another story. At any rate, I've been involved in a lot of things. I started out really being active in Pacifica in 1995 when I joined the Open Space Committee. My primary goal then was to kind of push the acquisition of Cattle Hill forward, the National Park Service acquisition. But then from there, I kind of migrated onto the Planning Commission. I was on there for a number of years. And then while I was on the Planning Commission, I also was a liaison to the Golden Gate National Recreation Committee. And that was a good experience, working with a development scenario being planning, and then of course the natural elements of the Park Service. Then currently I'm on the Open Space and Parkland Advisory Committee, but I've also been a member of in and out active member of the Pacifica Beach Coalition and the Pacifica Shorebird Alliance. Today we went out and did a bird survey today, and we got, I think it was up to 26 western snowy plovers we spotted, counted on Linamar Beach, so that was pretty exciting, along with other birds we saw on several other beaches. At any rate, long-time resident Pacifica. I love the natural areas in Pacifica. I've also been an active member of the GGNRA Conservancy for many, many years, both as a volunteer, pulling weeds, putting in native plants and whatnot, what have you. And so I have a real interest in protecting the natural integrity of our beaches. I really think that's extremely important. And my other topic of interest, which I think I put on the application primarily, was I'm real concerned about our California Coastal Trail, so that'd be one of the things I'll be looking at while we're on this group. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Connie Menifee, and I'm a 26-year-old, I wish, 26-year resident of Pacifica, and I live back in Park Pacifica. And when I first came to the community, pretty early on, I chaired the Pacifica School District Modernization Committee that resulted in one of the early bond measures, and then I served on the Bond Review Committee for 10 years. I was on the school board as well. I think I may have come right after Julie on the Pacifica School Board, and let me see, school board, and currently I'm president of the Pacifica Daly City Democrats. I recently retired as a deputy city attorney with the city and county of San Francisco, and my last assignment had me on airport legal out at SFO, which, as we all know, is struggling with their own dramatic sea level rise problems.
I'm Jim Kramer. I've lived in Sharp Park on the other side of Route 1 only since I retired in 2008. But my wife was born here in 1947, and I lured her away when she left college. So she's been back intermittently since then, but we have deep roots together here in this town. I was really glad to retire back here. I'm a retired professor of oceanography and research scientist. I worked on sort of coastal ecological issues, doing computer modeling and simulation of these things at a number of different coastal habitats, but none in Northern California. I hope that my expertise from that scientific perspective would be useful in this committee. Mostly I really was enjoying retirement, but I thought maybe I would sign up, I would volunteer for this, and here I am. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all. I just want to acknowledge that the level of expertise and experience, and I think familiarity with Pacifica, I think we just have a lot of resources here at the table that we'll be able to draw from. And again, we really appreciate the time that you're dedicating to this effort. It's going to make this, it's going to be really important that you're here. So why don't we start with just introduce members of the team, both from the ESA team and city staff, and then we'll invite members of the public to introduce themselves. And we are running a little bit behind on schedule, so I'm going to ask the members of the public just to say their name and what neighborhood you live in, and leave it at that, and so we can get into the actual agenda for the meeting.
Hey everyone, I'm James Jackson with Environmental Science Associates, and I'm the project manager.
Hello, I'm Tina Wermeister. I'm the city's planning director.
Again, Kevin Woodhouse, city manager.
I'm Bonnie O'Connor, assistant planner.
I'm Matt Marvin with Kearns West.
I'm Phil King. I'm an economics professor at San Francisco State. I'm doing the economics for this study.
I'm Bob Battaglio, Vice President with Environmental Science Associates and also a Pacifica resident.
Okay. Sue Vaderlas, Mayor Pro Tem.
Gina Zari, Government Affairs Director for San Mateo County Association of Realtors.
Kelly Marasco, Park Pacifica.
Kathy Moresco, Park Pacifica.
Chris Redfield, Park Pacifica.
John Keener, Mayor, and I live in Lindamar next to San Pedro Creek.
Celeste Langell Lindemar.
Stan Zeven Lindemar.
Margaret Goodale Lindemar.
Frank Vella Lindemar.
Richard Harris Haight-Ashbury.
Sue Beckmeyer Lindemar.
Jane Northrup. I'm with the Pacifica Tribune tonight. I'm reporting on this.
Timothy Cowan Lindemar.
Last but not least.
Nicole Jontag Sharp Park.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to now walk us through the objectives for the meeting. So first of all, we kind of want to start at the beginning. So recognizing that this is the first of several meetings this group will have, we certainly want to make sure we all know each other and get to know each other, because we're going to be working together over the course of the next year plus. But we really want to start at the ground floor of this local coastal plan update process, what the purpose is, how the process normally works, and there is some consistency as they are done throughout the state, and then also in particular how how much work has been done so far in Pacifica, where we are now, and where we're going. And so before we get too far into the maps and the details and the input, we want to make sure everyone is crystal clear on what the process is, how it's working, and what kind of input we're going to need from you all and the broader community to have an informed process and for the city of Pacifica. So
Ben, if I could ask a question, please. Right here, right in front of you.
Sorry, Gordon.
Yeah. In light of that, in terms of the process and things like that, I was hoping we would have an agenda review and at least some type of opportunity to interject or comment on the topics you have. As one of the things, for example, that I didn't see in the draft agenda is how this group is its intended purpose, as well as the process that we'll go through here. And so I hope we can, somewhere in your agenda, accommodate those type of things. There might be other comments that people have to the agenda. That's normally what I see in most meetings. We have a review and a comment before we proceed.
Absolutely. Yeah, Gordon, that's the next slide. I appreciate that. And what we do want to make sure we do today is, and I think in each meeting, we want to make sure we're bringing material to you all, and we have an opportunity for you to provide input on it. So as we go through this process, we're going to kind of iterate on things. So there will be multiple times for you all to provide input on various drafts of things as we go through the process. But I think your point about making sure you folks are comfortable with the agenda, happy to do that, and we can certainly do that as we go to the next slide. Thank you. So the vulnerability assessment, the draft vulnerability assessment that ESA has developed, some of you may know is on the city's website, and there are copies in the room that I think Bonnie has been handing out. So James is going to walk through the draft vulnerability assessment. You all will certainly be invited to review it and provide comment if you like. But this is sort of where we are in the process, is the vulnerability assessment phase. And so we want to talk about what that means, and then we'll have an exercise, a mapping exercise. You see these maps here. We'll explain what kind of input we're looking for. But the idea today, since we're in this sort of phase of the process, is this is the input we're hoping to get from you today. And it's mainly around community use areas and potential areas of concern. So this is sort of what are the areas that are potentially vulnerable to sea level rise. I'll explain more of what the exercise is, how it's going to work, all that, as we get to it. But that's generally sort of the main objectives of the meeting. The agenda that we have today, before we get to the overview of the actual local coastal plan update process, we do want to do an icebreaker exercise, which I'll explain after I go through the agenda. So just sort of LCP 101 and where are we in terms of Pacifica's LCP update. That's the overview piece. Then James is going to walk through an explanation of what the vulnerability assessment is, what the approach is for developing it, and sort of where we are in the process. And then we'll have the mapping exercise, and again, I'll get into more detail on that when we get there. And then we will review action items, next steps, including the public workshop, which has been scheduled for February 13th. And my goal is to get you out of here by 8 o'clock. So, to Gordon's point, are there any questions about the agenda? Is there anything that you'd like to add or suggestions for revisions before we get started?
I've got a couple
Okay.
suggestions at least.
Okay.
One of the things that I think we all saw as in reporting about this meeting, this work group, et cetera, there were some people claiming transparency issues, things that weren't produced out of the ad hoc committee or whatever it was called, various documents. And I've now seen documents, status reports coming forward on the site. I'm wondering about generally minutes from meetings like this for people who can't watch or attend the meetings, what we might have for that.
Okay, so that's a great question. So we are on television, so that's thing one for transparency. I assume this will be archived. Is that right? So this will be accessible. Matt's developing a meeting summary. That summary will be available and on the website. So that'll be available to you all and everyone in the room. The PowerPoint that we're showing now, that will be on the website as well. Great. And so our goal is to make everything that you all are reviewing. So the documents that we're going to talk through today, those are all available on the website now. So we, of course, want to make this as transparent as we can. And if you have suggestions, we're certainly open to those.
Okay.
Sure. Briefly, if I make comments about something that I think is important in the vulnerability assessment, or someone from the public does, how do those get collated, and are we all made aware of the suite of comments that have been given, or how will this sort of wide-scale sharing of comments be accomplished?
Yeah, James, do you want to touch on that? So there's a draft document out now. How do you aggregate all the comments, and to what extent are those comments then either available, or what do you do with the comments?
Yeah, so a part of this meeting, we have a form that folks can provide us more detailed comments, and also comments are also accepted by email or other means, can be sent to Bonnie O'Connor. And we will consider these comments as we update progress the vulnerability assessment, and we can work out a plan to compile all those comments and make them available as a part of that final draft.
Does that help, Jim?
Yeah. So you would collate the disparate comments maybe into groups, and then maybe either you just leave them there, I suppose, or respond to them in groups. There'll probably be a few key points that maybe deserve some attention. Okay, that sounds great to me.
Gordon, did you have another? Okay.
So I'm curious as to what your view is of our particular roles here outside of attending meetings and contributing here during the meetings. Do you intend, for example, to produce other draft reports, papers that we would comment on? Is there an expectation that we may have, well, I'll call them homework assignments, in which we'd have another working group within this for those type of things? I'm wondering what your expectations are for the workings of the work group.
Right. So that's a good question. And Tina or others, I'd invite you to weigh in here. But I think that there's certainly an invitation as draft documents like the vulnerability assessment are released to get your comment on it. And so we are certainly interested in getting those comments. I think that generally what we're hoping to do is get as much input from you all when you're in the room, so you're not doing that too much homework, because we realize you folks are busy. And so we want to try to make these meetings as productive as possible, so we can actually sort of pick pieces of the documents we want to review on and actually workshop them in the room. So with that said, if you have time and interest, we want to make those documents available, and if you want to go through them and provide comments, we're certainly open to that. Yeah, and I think it's going to evolve as we sort of get to know each other and figure out what's the best way to work with you all. So I think, and we're open to suggestions.
Okay. Especially as I looked at the schedule, there are essentially two meetings, this meeting and the next. The third one seemed as kind of like a wrap-up on which things are done. So it seems as if whatever we'll do tonight and then the next one, and that would be it. And I don't know whether or not that's sufficient or not, but that's based on what your expectations might be and those on the work group as far as what they might contribute. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so a part of that would be, is there a more detailed work schedule or more anticipations for work that you might have of us?
Yeah, so when we get into the presentation, James is going to walk through a more detailed work schedule.
Okay.
And if you have questions from there, let's take those questions then.
Okay, cool. In terms of sharing with each other, it would be helpful if we had contact information from all of the work group members.
Okay.
For example, if we have some type of work result that we'd like to make sure we share to everybody.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we'd want to make sure if folks are comfortable with their information being available.
But not?
And I would suggest that maybe the method to do that would be via staff.
Right.
So to Bonnie to distribute?
Right.
Yeah. And that's to make your lives easier again and to help kind of manage the information flow. So if that works for you all, that's something, we certainly understand the sort of the value of group thought, but if we can help facilitate that, we'd like to do that.
Okay. Then the final result of the workings here is produced in a recommendation paper you will present to the city or to the Coastal Commission. I'm not quite clear what the
We're going to get to that.
ultimate work result.
Yeah, we'll get to that when we get through the timeline. We'll talk about where we are and where we're going.
Okay. Thank you. That's it for you.
Okay.
I'll be back.
We'll be here. Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, what I'd suggest is let's have this meeting. When we wrap up, let's kind of talk about how it went. And I think if there's strong feelings about an adjustment, let's talk about it. But I'd say let's get to the meeting. Let's talk about how it went, and we want to be flexible. But let's start, and then let's see how we do. But we do want to be responsive. If folks feel like you need more time, we can certainly have that conversation then.
Well, for those of us who are not technical, this is a lot to absorb and evaluate on.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Could you talk into the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. I said for those of us who are not technically oriented, this is a lot of information, right, and we need help.
Yeah. Okay. That's understood.
And I know we want to get the meeting started, but I also wanted to ask about ways for public input and how that will be handled. And I don't know if it's covered in that agenda. I believe we're all open and able to talk to public and to have people come up to us and share their input as members of the working group. But I don't see a spot on the agenda for that. And so what's the mechanism going to be to collect public input?
Next slide.
Other than the workshop. So is there...
Yeah, it's on the next slide.
Okay, so that's our next slide. Perfect segue.
Thank you very much. Any other questions before I want to use that segue? Okay, so actually it's one after this one. So this is similar to Kevin's point, I think, is again, my job is to keep us focused on the agenda, and my request to you is to help me by staying on the meeting objective, staying on the topic at hand. That'll just make the best use of everyone's time and the best use of your expertise. We do have time limits. My goal is to get you out of here by 8 o'clock, so my request is to do your best. I'm not going to shut anyone down or anything, but we want to be mindful of your time. So please do try to honor the time limits that we've sort of set in the agenda. We understand there are a lot of different perspectives in the room, and I think that's all very fair. And my request to you is just to be respectful of those differences and sort of, and just understand that that's going to be part of this conversation. Folks are going to have different opinions, and we're going to talk about that. Please turn off your cell phones if you haven't already. That would be helpful. So any questions about these ground rules? Do these seem okay? Agreeable? Okay, seeing head nods. Okay, so public participation, to your question, Cindy. So the focus of the discussion is recognizing we have 2 hours is really the members of this work group. And with that said, we want to use this opportunity to get input from members of the public who've taken time out of their day to participate. So the way that we're planning on structuring it is that for the majority of the meeting, it's essentially a meeting of the work group. and members of the public are welcome to observe. At the end of the meeting, the mapping exercise, which is the way that we're planning on getting input from this group today, we're going to invite members of the public to do the same exercise. So, but part of the reason we're doing it is that is we want to be able to kind of talk through the comments of the work group in the meeting, and we can have a similar conversation with members of the public at the end of the meeting. But that's how we're structuring it. So there will be an opportunity for input both from this group and from members of the community. We will talk more about the public workshop that's coming up on February 13th as well. But you know, that's our goal of trying to accommodate the interest of having public input. Okay, yes, Jim? Are you sure? Yep. Okay. So what we'd like to do as an icebreaker, just recognizing, again, you folks are going to be working together. We'd like to have you get to know each other a little bit better. What we'd like to do is organize into groups of 4. We'll try to do this pretty quickly. But we'd like to have you organize into groups of 4 and just have a quick group conversation about 2 questions. What's your favorite place or activity along Pacifica's coast? And what's your biggest concern related to sea level rise in Pacifica? So we'll give you about 5 or 7 minutes, just sort of go around in your group of 4, talk about it. We'll ask one of you to report back on some of the sort of the key themes that came up, report those out, and then we'll just sort of all share that. But we're interested just sort of get an initial sort of temperature check from folks in the room of what's on your mind as it relates to this topic, just so we can be aware of that. So any questions on that? Okay, so I'm going to invite you 4 to sort of group together, the 4 of you, the 4 of you, 4 of you. And please self-volunteer or appoint a report out person. We'll give you about 5 minutes.
Get her chair back here, but
I'll soon. Happy to write things down if you want. I don't know.
We're going to be sitting along.
Do we want to start with our favorite place or activity?
Sure. Hiking in the Pacifica.
I can't remember. I didn't take notes, but I can.
I know. How do you pick your favorite? So I'm not going to. I'm going to say 2. I like walking along and going up to Maury Point, and then my other favorite place is the dunes up in North Pacifica. I think that's kind of a magic city place.
Favorite place is
I'll be interested to hear what themes emerge. So let's see. Why don't we start over here with this first group? So maybe you could just tell me a bit about what kind of, both on the topics of favorite place activity and biggest concerns, what kind of themes emerged for your group?
So favorite activities were hiking everywhere from the Pedro Point headlands to being up at the sand dunes in northern Pacifica, really all along the coast, the coastal trail that Ron mentioned, which came up because we all go on that, and then also just the vistas and views for those that aren't able to go out and bike or hike those things, just being able to see them and experience them and enjoy them. And then, are we doing both of them? So now our biggest concerns. A mix, everything from concerned about building out open spaces because there's recognition that those spaces are opportunities to accept water when it overflows and if sea level does rise. Recognizing the need to develop a plan for the long term, taking an approach of sustainability, of looking at future generations and understanding that the actions we take today are going to be impactful many years down the road. An interest in making hard decisions now. And then also an impact of, looking at some fears about what we might be losing in the short term or some point in the future, and making sure that planning is done fairly with evaluating all options and understanding what resources are available.
Okay, thank you.
So there were two questions, right? The
Microphone?
microphone.
Oh, you don't have. Sorry. There you go.
So some of the favorite things that were shared by our group were the trails and biking along Lindemar Beach and elsewhere, walking through the quarry, the trail through the quarry and up and over Maury Point. It's all in trails. We have some great coastal trails. And Rockaway Beach Headland, walking over that. So, and surfing and hikes. The fact that we can have many trails to hike on and a great ocean and waves to surf. Okay. Infrastructure damage is our biggest concern from global warming, sea level rise. We wonder if there's solutions to abate sea level rise, like a reef, things that have been used in other countries. We thought of, I can't remember the name of the country, in Northern Europe where they have all the windmills, the Netherlands. Holland, okay. Yeah. And the way they pump, they have them stationed so they pump water out all the time, and just all by wind. And also flood insurance and the consequences for property values. If people have to have flood insurance, is that going to affect their property values, or will they be denied homeowners insurance, in fact, if it gets to be too drastic? And finally get some legislative support from our representatives who have been, are very capable and helpful, have been very helpful in the past. Okay, that's it.
You want to just hand that? Yep. You want it?
Sure. So our group's main favorite activities were hiking, surfing, and kayaking. And favorite place anywhere along the beach or Maury Point, hiking trails. And our biggest concern was, we read these papers and there's all these assessments done for how much damage is going to be done or what the sea level rise is projected to come across. But what if there's an event such as a king tide, major rain? Like, how do we use that information to what damage that's going to do? So we want to know if that kind of study is going to be done or if we're going to include that. And another concern was how are they going to clean up all the properties that's already been damaged and just sitting there.
I think we're all ready to me.
Oh, you got one.
Hi. I was going to go through all four people one by one, but I can see it's much more sensible to coalesce the opinions a little bit. Pretty much all four of us liked walking our dog, some on Lindemar Beach, some on Sharp Park Beach here. All of us agree that on Lindemar Beach the dogs are leashed, so we're very careful about that. And then some people like other things as well. Everybody mentioned dogs, but some mentioned playing golf at the Sharp Park Golf Course, and a couple people thought that sort of just general appreciation of nature, like being surprised at a whale as you're on the beach, is exhilarating and very special about our something we really like. And then the concerns that we had, I thought I've had a chance to think about it a little bit more. I'm wondering if it's a microcosm of what the whole, maybe you intended this, microcosm of what we're going to be about the next times that we deliberate. One person felt that the fear was that we would sacrifice the economic engine that is so important to Pacifica. And by that was meant things like the wastewater treatment plant and the beach boulevard, and that if we didn't protect those, that we would lose our economic engine. Another person felt that they were going to lose the integrity of our beaches, which my reaction was, that's another part of our economic engine, and yet those things are head-to-head, and there's a real face-off there maybe. Another person was concerned about the impact on people, but by that was meant mostly property values and the loss of property values rather than an alternative way that people could be impacted, all of which are legitimate. And then I'll identify only myself. What I was most concerned about was how are we going to manage to resolve what I see as some pretty fundamental head-to-head conflicts in a consensus that we all see is valid. I see that as very tricky, and of course, as a scientist, I feel that we have to start that process by agree, and I'm afraid we won't be able to agree that there are factual, evidence-based foundations that we should base the argument on, and if we start with that, maybe we can reach a consensus. That's what we thought, and maybe it's a microcosm, or a preview or something.
Looking for your mic.
Oh.
I wasn't, but I should probably use it. Thank you. I was just taking a look. So certainly hiking and walking seems to be a common theme. Access to nature, whether it be the hills, the ocean, the animals that live around here, the different recreation options. Those are all, I think, appreciated. Concerns about how it's going to impact. I think folks really value this community. So what does it look like in the long term of the things that you value, and then also just your living, so the value of your property, the infrastructure that you use every day, things like that. And then I think I'm also sensing there's a little bit of, a little bit of nervousness of how we figure this all out. It's a thorny.
Said something about science at the end, and I think that should be up there.
Okay. So you second that? Okay. Right. Yeah, I do think, for what it's worth, this is my sort of stock and trade in conflict resolution, but I do think that, finding agreements and building on those agreements is a good way to handle larger conflict. So that's something that we're trying to tease out, is where are the things that we can agree on and how do we build on that. So that's something we're going to work on. Well, thank you for that. This is just helpful for us to get a sort of a temperature check. There's certainly commonality here, which is encouraging. I assume other folks in the room would nod their heads on some of this stuff. As we go through the process, we answer this question in a couple months, it might be different. But it is helpful for us to know this as we go through the process. Recognizing that these are technical issues, we are going to get into the meat of the presentation. I'll invite James. Actually, I'll invite Tina to come up and just talk about sort of where we are now, and they'll sort of work together on giving you the overview.
Hello again. Again, my name's Tina. I'm the city's planning director. And so what I'm going to do over these next few slides is just give you a high-level overview of what a LCP, what a local coastal program is, and talk a little bit about the city's LCP and where we're going ultimately with the sea level rise and adaptation planning process. So within the coastal zone, and in Pacifica, that's mainly defined as everything west of Highway 1. There's a few little notches here and there outside of Highway 1. The Coastal Commission, under the State Coastal Act, actually has land use authority. And so what does that mean? Land use authority means that the agency that has jurisdiction can decide what appropriate land uses and what the development criteria are for that area. But within the Coastal Act, I think recognizing that each community is very unique and there's unique regional issues everywhere within the state. It's not a one-size-fits-all. There's the ability for local cities to adopt what's called an LCP, a local coastal plan. And so it needs to be prepared under the context of the Coastal Act. And once a city approves the LCP, and then the Coastal Commission needs to review and approve it also. And once that's complete, then the permitting authority, the land use authority, gets transferred to the city. So it's an important tool, again, all within the context of the Coastal Act, to make sure that cities are able to retain local control and, adopt policies that are appropriate for their area. It does, as I mentioned, does transfer permitting authority to the city. However, the Coastal Commission still retains jurisdiction and permanent permitting authority over certain areas, such as tidelands, public trust lands, and acts on certain appeals. So sometimes a city's action can get appealed to the Coastal Commission. Generally, if you, this isn't across the board, but generally speaking, the beach at the bottom of our bluffs, that area is in the Coastal Commission's jurisdiction, and everything that would be like on top of the bluff or behind the beach is within the city's permit jurisdiction under our LCP. So Pacifica does have an LCP. It was, the land use policies were last adopted in 1980, so it's been quite a while, and we're due for an update. And we actually started that process many years ago, I think in 2009 or so. And so when we started that and got through the planning process, by the time we got to the end, the Coastal Commission had adopted sea level rise planning guidance and requirements that adaptation planning be incorporated into LCP. So we're missing a key component at this point. And so that's the purpose of this sea level rise adaptation planning process, is to create that chapter, if you will, in our LCP and incorporate it so that we can be in conformance, get an updated LCP adopted, and retain our permit jurisdiction within the coastal zone. So some of the goals and benefits of this project include to bolster the efficacy of public safety efforts, to respond to climate change, to preserve housing and enhance environmental justice. And I wanted to point out, as you all know, you live here, is that much of our older housing stock is within the vulnerable area, within the coastal zone, and it's a source of naturally affordable housing, so it's important. Also to promote a local economic vitality, as was mentioned, I think in our breakout groups, that much of the city's commercial tax base is within our coastal zone, so it's very important to understand. And then, of course, to preserve and enhance coastal access and recreation opportunities. So with that, I believe you're all familiar with our website address there, and I just wanted to mention, I think I'm required to do so, that this is being funded through a grant from the Coastal Commission as well as the Coastal Conservancy.
Tina, can you define what you mean by enhance environmental justice?
Meaning that we are paying attention to the areas that may house people who are more vulnerable. Maybe they're not, they're lower income, and they're not able to participate in some of these processes. So we're acknowledging that some of our lower income areas are within vulnerable places in our community that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to.
Okay.
So with that, I will turn it over to James.
I'm sorry, could you, so the local coastal plan, so we're doing a subsection of the local coastal plan, which is why we're called the Sea Level Rise Community Working Group, I think.
Right.
And so is the current version, are we using the draft version of the 2009 that was drafted around that time?
Yeah,
that we're updating?
just to clarify, this process started in 2009. I think the process concluded more like 13 or 14. It still doesn't include the adaptation planning. And I recognize that because you're here, you may be more informed, but many people in the community, a local coastal plan, adaptation planning, it's still language that, what does that mean exactly? And everybody knows what sea level rise planning means, essentially. So this is a way, we're using different terminology at different times, but it's a way to make sure that somebody who may not be as plugged in still understands, hey, you know, if I go to this webpage, this is what I'm going to learn about.
So there does exist a draft LCP now that you just said started in 2009 and maybe drew to some sort of completion in 2014. Does that exist somewhere, and then we're working on is a sea level rise update to that? Is that correct?
That is correct.
We probably can ignore that plan because most of that doesn't interact with our deliberations, or is that draft plan available?
It is available. It's on our website. We can forward you all a link to it. And the idea here is that the adaptation policies will be melded into the existing draft.
I have one more question. The Coastal Commission has provided a grant that supports this whole process, and I looked at that award letter, and it's very specific about what we should do. I mean, in the general steps, it's quite specific. It doesn't tell us what the answer is going to be, but it tells us exactly how we do that. Can you just say a sentence or two about how that proposal was? Did we submit a proposal and then they replied with that? What's the process by which we got that award and this whole thing got kicked into motion?
Sure. So the Coastal Commission issued a request for applications. We said, hey, we think we're a good fit for this and we need it. And I think we need it. And so we went ahead and prepared an application, and we took that to the City Council to authorize staff to submit that application. And then it went through the Coastal Commission process and we were selected.
Can that application to the Coastal Commission also be posted?
Sure.
I'm just interested in how it got to be so structured, so carefully structured, whether we should provide the initiative for that or whether it all came from the Coastal Commission.
Thank you, Tina.
Oh, James, I have a question here. It's a little bit. Could I ask a question? Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Yeah. It might be a little off track. I'm not sure, but yeah, I got this handout here from the San Francisco Gulf Alliance. Is this sanctioned by this? Is this appropriate for this venue here? This purview here? Is this? I didn't see this up there on the table when I got information, but these things were passed out.
To that question.
That was submitted and handed out here, and so it is ultimately going to be part of the record. So
I guess I just feel it a little bit belligerent about sticking this on in front of everybody's face when it's not part of the material that's on this table. That's all.
Yeah,
I just thought I need to add that
because there's other public comments, right, that have been coming in, and where are those? If we're getting this from the Golf Association, we should be getting all the other public comments as well.
Where are the, if there are a bunch of other public comments that are on hard copies, where are those? Why aren't they here too with these? That's all, so that's all. Yeah, so anyway, it's a little disturbing for me. So other than that, let's go forward.
We will be accepting public comments through the end of February, and I'll talk about that more as we progress. So I just wanted to start off by kind of painting the overall picture of how this process works, the LCP update in the context of sea level rise. And as Jim just brought up, the Coastal Commission is the driver for this work, and they've issued guidance on the process and recommendations on how to go about the various steps. And so in our project here, we're following the Coastal Commission guidance and guidance from the state of California. And the first thing that you do is you identify what sea level rise projections to consider for your community.
I think it's focused. It's just a little bit of a fuzzy graphic. My apologies, but I'm going to read it out for you. The first step, which we have already done, is to identify the sea level rise projections that we will use to analyze impacts for the segment of coast for which this LCP governs. The next step will be to identify the impacts from those various sea level rise amounts, and that is also the second step that we've already completed. Those first two steps are summarized in our first deliverable, which I'll discuss in a minute, covering those scenarios. And from that, figuring out the sea level rise amounts, determining what the impacts are, i.e. the hazard exposure, if you will, what the hazards cover, the flooding and erosion. You then assess the risks to all the coastal resources, so built resources, natural resources, private property, various communities, business districts, infrastructure, habitats, and recreational uses, tabulating those impacts and assessing the risks from the sea level rise amounts and the hazards that correlate with them. So here we are today talking about our draft vulnerability assessment. From there, we will be finalizing the vulnerability assessment and moving into the stage of identifying adaptation measures to address these vulnerabilities along the coast. And also will ultimately lead into the development of policy language that we'll use to update our city's existing draft LCP. Once those updates are made and we bring them to the city council and clear them internally as a city, we submit to the Coastal Commission for their approval, which then gives the city the authority to implement these policy changes and land use management tools and progress into the future. And this is an iterative process. As we get 30 years into the future, the picture, the sea level rise will likely change and will need to be reevaluated. And so again begins the cycle.
Stick on that. This is obviously very important. So do folks understand this? Is there anything about the different steps in the process and how we sort of iterate through it to get to a conclusion? Any questions about that? We'll talk about it more, but I think you'll see this over and over again about how we move from projections to potential impacts to risks to what do we potentially do about it, all the way moving into the LCP document. So does that, I just want to make sure that's clear before we move on, because I think that's kind of foundational to what we'll be talking about as a group.
So number 2 is checked off, but within number 2 is the area that identifies the specific risks in the areas by different area of the town, like this beach or beach that way or beach south of me. Is that what you're saying that 2 is identified already?
So we're going to talk about that. And yes, the impacts to the entirety of Pacifica, right. Where's flooding expected to inundate, where's erosion expected to progress, and then from those sort of hazard zones, we look at the risks to the assets that are in those zones. If I'm my address.
Hazard zones. Do we give specific addresses? I mean, I would love to know if my house was considered within a hazard zone, and I looked at the maps, but I couldn't determine that from the maps. So will that information, will that type of detail be provided by ESEA or the city?
That's a good point. Thank you for that comment.
I think some of the websites that are provided as resources, sorry, if I'm not mistaken, some of the websites that have been provided by other organizations that are working on these problems are providing online web resources that allow you to go right down to your house number and see where you sit in the hazard boxes. And
I understand that. In my profession, I'm very astute on the computer, but at home, this stuff would crash my computer at home. Okay, and a lot of people don't have the ability, technology, or the ability to really understand those sites. I think a printed list would be really helpful.
Of every address?
A list. Yes.
Well, how can you provide a list of every address that's in every hazard zone?
The library has lists of lots of things available to us, especially people that don't have computers at home. But
That's a very good comment, and I think that that's something worth considering when we're tabulating the impacts that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So just a reminder, these folks don't have microphones.
All right. Flag me down, and I'll hand you the microphone for future comments. Yes, Gordon.
If I could clarify then, as far as where we are, you say we're not really in 3, we're in 2 in terms, I mean, some of this exercise, as I understood from the earlier work group, is truly identifying those impacts or getting more information about those. Is that right?
Right. So let me clarify. Number 2 is determining what the hazards are, what the flooding hazards are, what the erosion hazards are, and where they are, what geographies they cover. Step 3 is focusing on evaluating what's within those hazard zones. So collecting all of the data of assets like property, infrastructure, habitat. And so, so for 2, we've identified that erosion will project, inland by 300 feet potentially at this segment of bluff. And erosion and flooding will, inundate this or that beach or low-lying area. That's step 2. Step 3 is what are in those areas that are, assets to the city of Pacifica and its residents. So the bluff top has houses built on the top of it, or it's open space and has some nice trails and lookouts. The beaches have some coastal infrastructure, a seawall protecting a promenade, or a wetland has some habitat. Tabulating all of the assets that are in those hazard zones that we've identified, and then from collecting all the data, we can paint a picture of what's the risk for these hazards. There might not be as much risk at an open space, like the quarry, other than nice scenic trails. Other areas may be more asset dense areas like Rockaway Beach, a lot of homes and businesses up on the coast. And that's what the task of step 3 is.
Then valuation of these scenarios, where's that? I know we have an economics expert here who I expect you're engaging, or you said you are. Where in your steps do we take a look at, if we realize these risks, here's what the financial impact is?
I think that's a great point. So that will be, so it's sort of a blend of part 3 and 4. And so when we look into the adaptation alternatives, we will be evaluating the value of all these assets and doing a comparison of cost benefit of what does it cost to armor or retreat, and what are the associated impacts or relief of impacts to those valued assets. So this draft vulnerability assessment, again, is painting the picture of what is at risk. Everything that's potentially at risk. We're looking at the maximum amount of flooding and erosion that we're going to be looking at in this study for the purpose of making sure that we've got everything accounted for. At the next stage, we'll look into more detail of the value of all those assets and start to weigh the costs and benefits of ways to adapt.
Will this group be involved in number 4, or are we just number 3?
Yes, definitely will be. That'll be the next, your next work group meetings. All right, Lindsay.
I don't know if I missed this, but when is the exact timeline? When should we expect that the draft will be updated, including our comments? And also, when should we expect to see the LCP being implemented? And when the draft is updated, will there be room for more public comment, or is this community work group just at this stage in the process?
Thanks. I'll be answering all of those questions on the schedule slide, but to answer briefly here, we'll be accepting public and comments from the work group through February, and we'll be incorporating those into our draft, or into our final vulnerability assessment.
But we will be inviting public comment on other pieces in the future.
Correct. So this is just the vulnerability. We're going to step into adaptation at that point with another round of draft documents and other deliverables that we'll be producing. We'll be reviewing them together in another set of work group meetings, and we'll have another public workshop for participation for a wider audience, accepting comments, et cetera. So we're kind of doing this sort of engagement process through each of these steps of the process. Yes, yeah.
Sorry, I have one concern that I have to bring up with your step one, which is identifying the range of the sea level rise projections. So in reading through the documents and seeing the mapping, where you're at is at 5.7 feet of rise, right? And taking that into consideration. Yet when you start looking at the documents in the newest one, which is the Rising Seas in California, the Griggs paper, you look within there and they talk about having that we should be using the higher assessment, the H+++ assessment, because of the fact that things are changing a lot faster than we have predicted. So then if you look at more of the source documents, you guys are using 5.7, yet NOAA and their mapping is at 6 feet. And then if you look further back where there's a lot of sourcing back to the Pacific Institute maps, they're much higher. So if you look at those examples, and obviously since I live in Pedro Point, you know, I studied very much what the vulnerability there is. If you look at that current map, it just shows that the water coming up from the creek affects the Pedro Point field that we have there just in one corner. Yet if you look at the Pacific Institute map, it shows that field completely underwater and up to the residential areas. So it's a double concern there that we're kind of using already this identified range of sea level rise for these projections, yet I'm not sure that's adequate based on what we've actually seen with some of the other inputs in the mapping that we actually have at our disposal. We start looking at further into the documentation and other mapping that's available.
All right. Yeah, that was a good question or series of questions. We are considering the H++ scenario to a degree, and I'll cover that. The trick here, working on a project that has a limited time and limited budget, is we are afforded the resources that are readily available, hazard mapping products that are readily available, that are the most current and updated products for coastal flooding and erosion. And so we are looking at the Pacific Institute study erosion, for example, and also the Cosmos, Our Coast, Our Future flooding. And so while we're selecting scenarios that are in line with the state guidance, we also have to be practical in finding the right hazard data that fit those scenarios. And I'll talk about those in just a second. So another step or another sort of topic of the Coastal Commission guidance is how do we adapt to sea level rise? And the Coastal Commission, as the guiding force behind this LCP process, they require us to look at and evaluate a range of adaptation alternatives, including the protect, retreat, and accommodate categories, as well as a hybrid of those. So in our study, we're going to be looking at all the options and laying them all out there so that everyone has the information and can understand the trade-offs of these various strategies. And ultimately, it's the city's decision to decide what type of policy language they're going to move forward with. And even more so, ultimately, the Coastal Commission is going to be the entity that either approves or denies this update. So this is just giving an overview of the sea level rise and adaptation planning and how we're going to look at the full range of options, and we'll be moving forward with input from everyone at the work group and the public and identify what's appropriate for Pacifica. Like I just said, engaging with everyone here in the community, in our working groups, throughout the process, at each stage, during the identification of the vulnerabilities, through the development of our adaptation, alternatives and policy recommendations is important to, keep this fully open and transparent to everybody. We're going to be updating identifying the policies to facilitate these adaptation plan alternatives. We're going to review the updates with the Planning Commission and City Council, and we'll get into the scheduling in just a second, and ultimately be submitting to our recommended policy updates to the Coastal Commission for approval. Here's an example of that original LCP from 1980. As you can see, the hazard map is a little dated. And here is an example of the draft updated map. So part of this process, we're utilizing the latest technology and science and understanding of sea level rise, and helping for the community to best understand what our potential impacts are, and really producing this study that it's going to benefit the public in the long run to get a good picture. So this map doesn't have the sea level rise hazards in it yet, because that's what we're doing right now. So the schedule, here we are, we're in January. We've already identified our sea level rise amounts and the hazard data by which to assess those sea level rise amounts, and that's our first deliverable that's posted on the website. We've also identified and collected asset information for the City of Pacifica and produced a memo detailing all the information that we have, as well as the remaining gaps that we are looking to fill, and hoping to get your input and assistance with identifying any sources. So that's number 2. And so in January here, we've issued our draft vulnerability assessment, and that's also posted on the website. And as I said, it's kind of the high-level take at the vulnerability assessment, looking at the worst flooding and erosion impacts that we'll be analyzing in this study to help facilitate facilitate input from everyone, and getting input on data gaps that we still need to fill, making sure that the assessment is robust and we've accounted for everything that's in these hazard zones. We're going to be moving forward to finalize the vulnerability assessment in the next coming months, as well as starting to develop a list of adaptation options for the various sub-areas of Pacifica. The deliverables from that task will consist of identifying sea level rise strategies, sea level rise adaptation strategies. We'll be doing a cost-benefit analysis of these preferred strategies or subset of selected adaptation strategies, and that will be incorporated, both of those will be incorporated into the draft adaptation plan that we anticipate having public available in April, and that will be available for comment, and we'll be then conducting our next set of working group meetings to review and collect input on that draft document. That will be then finalized, and we'll move into the policy development stage of the project, in which we develop policy language by which these adaptation strategies will be implemented in the LCP, and then review these policies with the City Council and Coastal Commission staff for approval.
Lindsay, is that your schedule question? Does that clarify, help, or any?
So we should expect the implementation phase to be after we finalize this LCP update. When should we start implementing?
So the LCP will be starting to be implemented once it is approved by the Coastal Commission. And so I'm not, yeah, that's the future beyond this project, but the ultimate goal of this project to help the city with developing LCP policies that will help.
James, I'm looking for the iterative aspect of this. I don't, for example, the April reports, I don't see an iteration within that, within the work plan. It's you produce it and then we discuss it in a meeting. So what's your idea on iterating through some of the findings?
So as a part of this meeting, we'll be collecting your comments as well as any help that you can provide us in identifying these data gaps like I mentioned. And from that, we can collect your comments at this meeting, or if there are more detailed comments that you would like to prepare, we are accepting comments from the public and work groups through February, and those will be compiled, and then the draft will be revised to address those comments.
And then, my question was as to that next, subsequent after you produce that report. I understand you're looking for input, we can certainly provide that, but I'm looking for those iterations from April on.
So we will, I guess we have, kind of one iteration to discuss, and we'll, address the comments that we have. If there's anything that's, very outstanding that is, needing of secondary attention, then we'll have to approach that as it comes.
I imagine that, so for this conversation around vulnerability, sorry I don't have a microphone.
There you have this one.
So I imagine the way this would work is that this is sort of conversation number one around the vulnerability assessment. The next time we come back together, we'll do two things. One, we'll recap what was all the input we received, both the last time this group met, with the technical work group that met earlier today, what information did we get from the public workshop, what other comments have come in, and what kind of key themes emerged from those, and we'll revisit those at the next meeting before we move on to the next topic. So we want to make sort of those connections between what we received through all the input that we solicited, and then how is that informing going through the next process. I mean, hopefully that, by iterate, Gordon, that is what you're asking. Does that help?
It helps to some degree. I think we're going to have to see it in action. I think our expectation is perhaps even more frequent meetings.
Gordon, I took your comment to be referring to the earlier slide with the small green squares, which talked about iterative things. But that iteration is over the long time frame, like 25 to 50 years. When we get information after 20 years on what sea level is really doing, then all this will have to happen again. In that sense, this whole process is iterative, but not our effort.
I'm not concerned about the next iteration of this. My comments are relative to this process that we're doing now.
And I just wanted to clarify for the questions about implementation after we're through to adoption, is I wanted to be clear about these types of key high-level policy documents that we're working on. Implementation may or may not be doing something really specific. It may be that the policy will be that the city will explore funding opportunities to maintain seawalls XYZ. And so there may be, the implementation may be a variety of things. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys understood or didn't have an expectation that it may be one single action item for a particular issue that the document may discuss. Or there may be multiple opportunities for funding for sand replenishment, things like that. So it may not be completely pinpoint specific on certain items.
Here, yeah, I guess. Oh, I'm trying to think I'm forgetting what I was thinking about here. When we get this done and the LCP is updated, based on our workshops and everything, is that a necessary component for going forward in terms of I guess, taking action on, because I can tell you right now, there are areas that I'm sure you know, that need some work and need some help right now as we speak. So I guess I'm just wondering, how long it's going to take, and okay, when the LCP is finally updated based on all of our input and the various assessments and whatnot, what have you, then what stage after that? I mean, where do we go from there after the LCP's been what we would say updated completely? So
Well, maybe to address the first part of your comment, you're correct that there are critical infrastructure areas that are currently being impacted, and Public Works, through the direction of the City Council, is working on protecting areas of our town. So there is not like we're stopped and waiting for this process to be completed. And I guess maybe I didn't understand the second part of your statement. I feel like kind of the comments about it being an iterative process into the future might have addressed your question.
Yeah, I guess I just wondered the next step after that's updated. I mean, does that give you more support with getting the funding needed to make this is what it is? So that's I just want to kind of get a big concept of what this whole thing's about. So that's all. Thank you.
Can you clarify, so by the time we meet next, which is in May, will this draft vulnerability assessment be finalized by you, or do we still go back and look at that again in May?
It will be finalized at that point, pending all the input that we collect today and anything else that you may identify upon further review over the next month. So again, looking for everyone's concerns and comments and inputs by the end of February to help us to stay on track with the project and to finalize the vulnerability assessment. The next set of working groups meetings will be concerned on the development of the adaptation options and the draft adaptation plan. Sure. Of course, and the city website also has a version of a project schedule, but we can make this this graphic available.
Can I, excuse me, on our comments, public comments, et cetera, how are they evaluated and possibly incorporated into the plan, or are they just an addendum?
So that was brought up earlier, and we're going to work with the city staff to come up with a way to compile all the comments, and they could be attached to the final report as an addendum, and with brief descriptions to address
That's my question is they're just attached. They're not incorporated or considered or.
Of course, that's why we're asking for the comments. We will incorporate them into the report, and for the benefit of everyone, we will attach all the comments so that people can see, what.
Okay, and who determines what gets incorporated?
We will review them with the city staff, and if there are competing comments, we'll have to deliberate on how those are addressed. But that's a part of the process to identify what comes in and what the concerns are, and how to best address those and incorporate them. Are there any other questions on the schedule? Peter?
Thank you for all the stuff that you're sharing with us. I just wanted to find out how, based on the guidelines that you shared with us and the schedule, how different is that from all of the work that has already been done by the Bay Conservation and Development Committee on their studies on sea level rise and how it's going to affect the Bay? Or is this an extension of what they've done so that we can add to all the work that they've done already?
Thanks, Frida. That's a good question. So the BCDC, they're focused on impacts within the Bay, so in a separate geographic region. But our work is kind of it sort of functions parallel to that work. The county, San Mateo, has produced their vulnerability assessment, and we're operating this project in the context of that study. So looking to be consistent with that study where feasible. And I think that a part of that study was also to consider that BCDC. So, it's a big state. There's a lot of regions that are going to have to grapple with this, and To a degree, everyone's under the same umbrella of the Coastal Commission and other jurisdictions that have been formed to guide these the planning process. So it's interrelated in that way, in that the guidance is issued on a broader level. Thanks, Peter. So Pacifica's coastal zone. Here we have a couple of figures showing the coastal zone in Pacifica. The figure on the left shows the coastal zone in green in Pacifica from the draft LCP update. And on the right, we have a figure from the draft vulnerability assessment showing the different community sub-areas that we are looking at. So we're looking at all the assets in all of Pacifica and considering the various hazards of flooding and erosion. And as a way to help focus on more area-specific adaptation preferences, we've broken down the coast, into sub-areas that follow the general plan and organization of the land use plan that Pacifica already has. So we've got Fairmont West up at the top, West Edgemar and Pacific Manor, Northwest Sharp Park, West Fairway Park and West Sharp Park and Maury Point, the Rockaway Beach, Quarry and Headlands area, Pacifica State Beach, and Pedro Point and Shelter Cove. And you'll notice that not in the coastal zone, but included in our study is the West Lindemar neighborhood. And we've included it because it is subject to flooding from San Pedro Creek and is already at risk of flooding from that source. And sea level rise will have an impact on that flooding potential. And so it was important to include that in our analysis and pull it into the big picture. So those are our sub areas, and those are going to be indicated on all the hazard maps that we're going to review in a little bit. And so if you're particularly interested in a neighborhood, you'll know that in the draft report we have digested the impacts and vulnerabilities for each of these sub areas, so that it is easier to identify, what are the major issues in each of these sub areas, and ultimately there's going to be some adaptation options that are more appropriate for one area than another. So we've got all of you assembled here today, and for that we are thankful. And what is your role? So the primary function of this meeting is to kind of kick off the whole engagement with the public and the work group, and to help understand the overall LCP update process and our technical approach to get through the process. A big part of the community work group is to ensure that the community values are considered in this process. It was great to hear of everyone's joys and concerns on the coastline, and that's exactly why we have this work group and why we're going to work together to make sure that our vulnerability assessment, adaptation plan, and policy reflects those values of the community. Another major function of these work group meetings, these initial work group meetings, is to help us to fill the asset data gaps that we've identified during the draft assessment, and to get your input on any key use areas or anything that you identify on the maps that's not considered. So we want to be able to be sure that our assessment is considering of all the assets and all the concerns of the public. And in that respect, members of the community work group, we are hoping that you can serve as community ambassadors to help engage the public in this process. For example, we'd love you to engage with people and invite them to participate in the upcoming public workshop that will take place on February 13th, in which we'll be going through this exercise, reviewing the draft vulnerability assessment, looking at the hazard maps with the public to facilitate more input. Yeah.
So the identification of these assets includes the businesses and residences also within the coastal zone, correct?
Yeah, the question was, does the assets include residences and businesses in the coastal zone? Yes, it does. We've identified all of the private property. We have all the parcel data for the whole city, and the associated values of those parcels. The businesses are included in that, all built infrastructure, et cetera. So we're completed. We've kind of covered this already, but to quickly reiterate, we've identified our sea level rise scenarios and the hazard data that we will be using to assess the impacts of these scenarios. And those are detailed in our first deliverable, the Future Conditions Scenarios Memorandum. All of these deliverables are posted to the city website and available. We've identified and collected all the asset data, including all the built assets, residences, private property, commercial areas, business, built infrastructure, natural infrastructure, habitats and recreation. And that information is detailed in a deliverable as well on the website. And we've gone through the first draft vulnerability assessment, compiling all these data together to determine what's the first, first cut vulnerability, what's at risk for the flooding and erosion that we're going to be considering, to make sure that we're considering everything and that we've got all the data that we need to make a robust vulnerability assessment. From there, we'll move forward through the adaptation strategies, and again, we'll be having another work group engagement on that, coming up with a draft adaptation plan with a cost-benefit analysis of these various adaptation options. Once the draft plan, adaptation plan is finalized, we'll be developing policy language to incorporate into the existing LCP draft and submit that to the commission. So.
Question back on that. I see that the words use critical assets. What is, it suggests that there's non-critical ones, if there's critical ones. But what would be a critical asset, and why the distinction there? Why wouldn't just any asset be considered?
So we are considering all assets and any assets in the city of Pacifica. The word critical is designated for assets that are a resource on a community-wide level, like PG&E gas infrastructure, wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, drinking water, communications lines. So the critical assets are categories that we can identify managers of those assets to help us, help facilitate the development of our adaptation. So we've issued surveys to asset managers, like, for example, the City Department of Public Works, and other like entities that are aware of and dealing with flooding and erosion impacts already, and will, in conversation with those entities, help us to get a head start on developing an adaptation solution for a given area, for example. So it's not that we're not considering non-critical assets. It was just a term that we used to, we're seeking input from asset managers in the city to help help facilitate the adaptation planning process.
And so the major amount of the private property is not considered as critical?
If I could clarify, I don't think critical means important. That's what it means. I think it's a matter of James can describe it. But I don't think it's about. I don't think it's a evaluation of what's important versus not. I think critical might have a bit of a different meaning in this context. So, is that right, James?
So its meaning is, if it's not critical, what is it?
Okay, so let's just 1 second. I want to do a time check. And so my job is to keep us on time. I recognize this is the first meeting, and so we're getting up to speed on what we're doing. It does come at the expense of being able to do everything on our agenda. So absolutely. No, I think I'm in agreement with you. I just want to acknowledge that it's going to be difficult to do everything today. We could talk about how we adjust on that. So what my proposal is that, again, I know your time is important, and I do want to be respectful of that. My proposal is that we go till 8:15, and that we try to sort of, it's important that we do this mapping exercise this evening. We'd like to do it. With that said, it's 25 minutes away from 8:15. So it's up to you. I'll leave it to you. I do want to get your questions answered. I want to put it out there that getting your input's really important on the content, and so there's a trade-off. So I'm not going to say that we're not going to answer your questions. We want to do that because you're right. The definitions are important. With that said, we want to get to the input part on the actual content. So I'll leave you with that.
It's true, but it doesn't get to, Julie, that's true, but it doesn't get to why something is labeled critical suggests, like I said, non-critical. And I did read all those, okay?
We had a couple hands.
And it doesn't give you an asset manager for those things, okay? For residential property, for example.
Let's get your question and then let's move on.
So I'm looking at the revised asset inventory, and I'm wondering, what is the significance that the Coastal Regional Sediment Management Plan is still in draft form, and how does that affect the reliability of that as source material?
I think the intent of utilizing the draft sediment management plan is to utilize erosion products, erosion projections that were produced for that draft, and those products are final. They're not in draft form. So the overall sediment management plan, I'm not sure of when that will be finalized or not. The point is that the erosion projections that were developed for it are finalized and incorporate more detail and are created for the different types of adaptation options that we're going to be looking at. And so we'll be utilizing these data that went into the study, not the incompleteness of the study itself. Does that answer your question?
So the data relied upon then is very limited, just the erosion.
Yeah, we're using the erosion hazard zones that were produced for that study itself.
Thank you.
Problem. All right, so let's get through the technical approach to the draft vulnerability assessment. We're going to talk about sea level rise, how that was looked at and chosen, the hazard data and the asset data, and the exercise that we're all waiting to get to is looking at what the vulnerabilities are. So planning for sea level rise is done on a future scenarios basis, and there's guidance from the state of California and the Coastal Commission that recommend appropriate amounts of sea level rise to consider. We're going with the values that are shown in this table here, and these are recommended by the state of California in their latest guidance that provides a range of likely sea level rise amounts that could be realized that are appropriate for different levels of risk. So if you're managing an open space or a natural park that is able to flex and doesn't have a lot of critical or important assets, you may be able to tolerate a little bit more risk, and so you may not have to be so conservative with your sea level rise selection. Conversely, if you're looking at important infrastructure that are key to the function of Pacifica as a whole, such as the stormwater and wastewater infrastructure and its associated pump stations and treatment plants, those are the types of assets that are less risk tolerable, and we thus need to consider the potential for higher amounts of sea level rise. So we've chosen a range of sea level rise amounts for the year of 2050 and 2100, and these are typical years that are chosen in a planning context, looking at a near-term 30-year time frame for 2050, and also keeping in mind that things will progress into the future. We have a long-term vision as well. So those 2 years are the time horizons or planning horizons that were chosen for the county study for San Mateo. We're operating, they're trying to be consistent with that study, and so we've selected sea level rise amounts for them that's appropriate. And so here we have 2050, our low risk sea level rise is anywhere from 1 foot to a medium high risk of 2 foot at 2050. At 2100, the same two categories yield a sea level rise amount of about 3 to 6 feet. And there's also the H++ scenario that was mentioned, a sort of extreme scenario that accounts for potential rapid release of ice from the Antarctica. And that's a scenario that we're evaluating in not applying 10 feet, because there aren't sea level rise maps for 10 feet, but we're considering that scenario by applying the potential impacts of 6 feet of sea level rise earlier in time when it would occur on that more extreme projection. Are there any questions surrounding the selection of sea level rise amounts?
You said that you based your projections on California guidance. Was that a particular study, the Grigg study, or were we given links to that study? I'm just curious, looking like the underlying mechanics that led to that process, projection.
The guidance, the state has issued draft updated guidance on sea level rise, and that is based on the Grigg study that you mentioned.
Okay.
Does that link, can we send that out if folks are interested?
Yeah, we could send out those documents.
We'll send that out.
They're referenced in our future condition scenario memos, but we're happy to provide links to those documents themselves. Any other questions on sea level rise amounts? So we've chosen our sea level rise amounts. How much sea level rise are we expecting or will be analyzing in the project? And we reviewed a number of studies that provide projections of erosion and flooding for future sea level rise, and that includes our CoStar Future, which utilizes Cosmos, the Pacific Institute, which has flooding and erosion projections. The Sea Change study by San Mateo County utilizes those first two sources, and so we've focused on those first two as our inputs. We've also looked at FEMA maps and recent storm events and other data to help us to make comparisons on what the existing forecasts or the existing projections for these other sources, how they compare to, say, a standardized flood map such as FEMA, and also to compare with recent events that have occurred.
Sorry, question. So previously FEMA actually referenced Pacific Institute. Has that changed? They were using the Pacific Institute maps previously, so I don't know if that's changed recently or not, but that would have been the case back in 2009, 2010.
I don't believe that FEMA incorporates coastal erosion at this time, and I'm not familiar with where they would reference the Pacific Institute.
For sea level rise, actually.
For sea level
the flooding,
rise.
yeah.
Okay. Well, so FEMA maps are produced for the current flood exposure, and perhaps they will be looking to develop their own sea level rise hazard projections. But at this time, it's sort of an existing conditions check that we looked at to compare against our CoStar Future flooding extents. Are there any other questions regarding hazard exposure data?
The public comment that was distributed, one of their comments was that the Pacific Institute, their maps did not account for existing coastal armoring structures in their mapping, like the effect of those. Can you explain that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. So the Pacific Institute study was conducted for the entire state. It was produced with historic data, and to some degree, very old coastal armoring structures are inherently accounted for in those projections, in that if it was built in 1910 and it has slowed down the bluff erosion or the shoreline erosion, those signals would show up in the historic data that were used to project future coastal erosion. But no, a coastal structure that was built more recently that hasn't had a chance to really show a signal in the data that were used for that study, it is, it is not considered. The point of this first draft of vulnerability assessment is to identify all areas and assets that are potentially vulnerable. We know that the Pacific Institute study is conservative for the reasons that were just pointed out, that it doesn't account for the effects of current or any future coastal armoring. But as we get into the adaptation stage of this project, we'll be looking to the erosion projections that were produced for the sediment management plan that do have alternatives for protecting the coast, which include coastal armoring and other types of interventions, as well as other adaptation options. So the point of this first draft is to really highlight everything that's potentially going to be impacted so that we can account for everything. We're then going to go into more detail using other erosion projections to evaluate the range of alternatives that we want to look at for this study, and those will consider coastal armoring for the appropriate adaptation strategies. Yes.
But if a structure, like you refer to armoring structures, say for instance like the promenade, the seawall that we have now on Beach Boulevard isn't considered into that projection, doesn't that affect the projected rate at which an area like a neighborhood would flood if that structure is not even included in the study? Or like say the levee out at the golf course, doesn't that sort of affect that amount where it says it's going to go inland? I mean, I'm sorry, it's real basic for me. It's the way I got to think.
That's a good point. So the question was regarding erosion projections, and so in that vein, the Pacific Institute study, it doesn't account for the effect of structures on erosion, but the flooding data that we're using, which is from OCOF, developed by the USGS, that modeling work does account for the terrain and the topography of any coastal arming structures, like the seawall that you mentioned right out here, and the berm constructed in front of the golf course. Those structures are a part of the flood modeling that was conducted, and for which projects we are using. Are there any other questions? All right. So we've collected all of our hazard data, and we're assessing the impacts on different levels of damage. The highest level of damage is long-term erosion. So a bluff erodes, a shoreline erodes, those assets, those lands would be lost entirely. We then look at what is inundated by regular tides, or a daily high tide, or long-term tidal inundation. So that's another level of damage that's going to be occurring frequently, but is not extreme unless we have a lot of sea level rise. We then look to storm impacts, which include storm wave damages, which is like some people may have witnessed out here at the seawall. We have wave overtopping, high velocity waves, high velocity moving water that can knock over people and move cars, damage structures, etc. And that damage function is an intense impact, but is a temporary impact, and those assets can be recoverable. Similarly, we're looking at storm flooding as the fourth level of damage. So not areas that are subjected to the high velocity water, but areas that would flood as a result of these coastal flooding events and the associated damages with those flooding impacts. They are temporary, and those assets and lands could be expected to return to service. So those are the four tiers of damage, the hierarchy of damages by which we assess how much an asset or a land or another habitat is affected. Oh, sorry.
So what about, I guess, levels of damage. I think about the big hunks of cliff that keep falling down and where the apartments went. Is that like not in this series of?
That would be under the long-term erosion. So the land is completely lost. When we're looking forward, projecting erosion, if the erosion is projected into, this row of houses or this facility, we're expecting the damage to be a complete loss. So we've, like we mentioned before, we've identified a large number of assets in the city of Pacifica, collected all the information that we could, considering all the assets in the city. That includes parcels, private property, commercial, businesses, infrastructure, recreational resources, etc. So we've categorized these assets as built assets, natural assets, such as beaches, streams, wetlands, critical species habitat, and access and recreation, as that's an important category in its own right. And so we've also got data on trails, parks, the golf course, beaches, the fishing pier, and a number of these items that are listed in gray are data gaps. So vertical access and lateral access, viewpoints, surfing areas and other recreational uses, parking and restrooms. These are the kinds of things that we're still looking for input on from you all in this work group and our other work group, the technical work group, as well as the public. So, question, Ron?
I'm looking at the list. Oh, yeah, good idea. Need all the help I can get. Yeah, on the list of endangered species there, you did overlook the western snowy plover. That's actually Pacifica's flagship bird. I mean, today we did a count, we counted 26 of them, if I'm not mistaken, out on Lindemar Beach. But anyway, I'd like to see that get added to that list.
That's exactly why we're here today.
Okay.
And I do have it right here, snowy plover as a data gap.
Okay.
So here's our data gaps summarized more thoroughly. Drinking water information, AT&T communications, natural gas, and electricity. These three asset categories we have not obtained outright in their as a data set that we could readily use and apply ourselves. We are working to develop a contingency or a sort of workaround for the lack of having possession of these data. For example, the PG&E, they don't like to share their information on where the gas and electric networks are, and that's understandable, but I've been speaking with the county representative, and they encountered this same issue, and so we're working on ways to share our information with them so that they can help us to understand without explicitly giving us the information on where these assets are, because it's a national security risk or whatever other concern. So we're working on ways to estimate or otherwise make some assumptions on how to include those assets. And what we're going to focus on today, most importantly with the community, is public access and recreation, which includes, like I mentioned, access to the coast, viewpoints and promenade areas to just go and enjoy the coast, any recreational uses, surfing and hang gliding, and dog walking, other types of uses, also attendance numbers, other amenities that are on the coast like public restrooms. So we're looking to get input on where those assets are and any data sources that we can use in our study, as well as natural assets, like I mentioned and Ron pinpointed the snowy plover. We don't have good spatial data on the distribution of those.
I see the word critical there too. I think that's important. I mean, he was bringing up the word.
Yeah, so critical, definition of critical here is a critical species in the context of the Endangered Species Act, to make that clear. We do have information on steelhead and some California red-legged frog, but we're looking to make sure that data is indeed robust and is at well represents the habitats on the coast. Now, Robin, that's all right.
But, you're talking about assets, and I saw, I live here in the neighborhood. So, to us, a really, really important asset that protects our neighborhood from flooding is the golf course because of that levee. And the Coastal Commission just ordered them in November, the San Francisco, to maintain it and in order to protect the neighborhood, and not just a golf course, but it protects Fairway Park and Sharp Park. You have coastal armoring structures. To me, I would consider that to be under critical because it protects us. Now it's existing, and they've already been ordered by the Coastal Commission to maintain it. But we have it under recreation too. So I sort of give me some guidance, please, on where we need to sort of include that, because it does two things, in my opinion. And I don't play golf, okay?
Yeah, so we do have the levee as a hazard mitigation asset, and that's listed in one of the maps that focuses on hazard mitigation assets. So it is considered as the berm itself as an asset that serves more than just coastal access or armoring, correct. Any other questions on the asset data? So in line with the data needs of our asset information, we also are interested in getting people aware and starting to think about some of the information that we're going to need to compile all of the costs and benefits associated with these adaptation plans. So we're going to need to evaluate all the assets in the city. And our economics needs, some of the high level points that we need to address are getting more robust numbers on attendance at beaches and parks, people that use walking and bike paths, and we have identified some data sources in our technical work group earlier, but if anyone here is aware of studies or other sources of data that we could use on attendance, that's highly valuable to us. Also the demographics and user profile of visitors, the types of recreational uses that people partake in at the beach, fishing, walking, biking, taking the dog out, surfing, and also the value of public property and infrastructure. We have parcel data, assessed parcel data from the county, and that provides values for most of the parcels in the city, but there's also some publicly owned properties that aren't in that data set, and so we need to get those information. So this is thinking a little bit ahead into the economics aspect of the adaptation planning, but it's important to get people to think about it and ruminate on that, and if people are aware of some studies or information that would help to feed into our economic analysis, we'd love to hear from you. So at this point, we're at the mapping exercise of the project, and we'd like to have everyone go around the room and review these maps, which contain all the assets and the hazard data, and identify, like I mentioned, missing assets and potential data sources that will help us to close the data gaps that we still have to fill in the categories of public access, parks and recreation data, ecological assets, and we're also interested in getting people's kind of overall feelings on high importance areas on the coast. Where are you going to walk your dog? What are some high critical areas that you see are valuable that need to that should make that we want to make sure to consider in our project. Yes, and so we do have information from the city on historic districts, landmarks, and that's included in sort of the land use and landmarks category, which are included already. So we do have that information, and I've worked with the city to help fill and make sure that that's complete.
So I guess we can post our concerns on as many maps as we like, each person.
Yeah, so Ben's going to walk through the specifics on that, and I just wanted to give a quick overview of what's shown on the maps, and Ben's going to talk about the process of actually posting your comment, writing them down, and how we're going to be collecting them. In addition to identifying any missing assets and potential sources that we can use to fill these data gaps, we're also interested to hear people's initial take on any adaptation plan ideas that they're aware of or that they would recommend for in a given area, as we're getting close to that stage. And so we also have that as a source of input that you all can contribute. So as far as the asset maps, we have on all of the maps, they each show the Pacific Institute erosion for 2100 that considers high sea level rise. And again, that it doesn't assume any coastal armoring structures other than the fact that some may show up as affecting the historic erosion. We also have the sea level rise, flooding, and wave impacts. So these hazards are on all three of the maps. So let me just describe that we have the erosion on all the maps, and we have the flooding in the form of storm flooding, inundation, flooding extents, as well as wave damage zone. And the difference between the three maps is that there's three different categories of assets. It's too much information to all put on one map, so we broke it down in a sensical way. And so the maps are broken down as community and land use maps, and this map has all the land use types, the city-owned parcels and other, the business districts, residential areas, community serving resources, like city-owned properties, the community center, for example, a senior center, affordable housing, communications networks, those type of the community-focused assets. We also have a hazard mitigation map, which includes assets like coastal armoring structures, flood protection, stormwater and wastewater infrastructure, pipelines and pump stations, police and fire departments, any hazardous material sites, Highway 1, a critical transportation corridor. So assets that are serving the public in the way of mitigating hazards and protecting public safety. The third category is public access and recreation and ecology. So the limited data that we do have, some of the habitat distribution that we have collected. We have information on hiking trails, and those are displayed in that map. But this is the focus of this exercise. People help us to identify any coastal access points, places of recreational benefit, and the like. So each station is a sub-area of Pacifica that is zoomed in, and you can look at these three various maps to view the hazards that are there and the assets that we've collected, and help us to identify any gaps, again, any ideas for adaptation, but specifically focusing on our main gaps of some of the habitat information, ecology, and recreation. And Ben is going to walk through the specifics of actually giving us the comments. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, before I do that, I do want to do a time check, and I want to acknowledge that it's about 8:15. We want to be respectful of your time, and we also want to get your input, so I'm going to leave it to you. This exercise takes about 20 minutes. Could take a little longer, but let us know if you're okay with that. We're happy to stay and do the exercise. I think it's a good exercise, but I want to check in with you before. I don't want to make any assumptions. So, are folks okay with that, or does anyone have concerns about that before we?
Feeling like it's a lot to be able to do, even in 20 minutes.
Fair enough.
Are these maps in a clearly identifiable way, or could they be posted online? Could we have those, I know they're there, but have them identified as, just as they are here, where everyone in the committee would be expected to go home and do their posting with a little more time to think about it?
So how about we do this?
Get the same job
This is going to be
done at
kind
home.
of a first cut, okay? And then let's talk about how we can do sort of homework, if you will, of additional comments. We just want to make sure that the maps are clear to you what they mean. It's not the granular house-by-house information on these maps because they're pretty small and we're covering a big area. But hopefully it gives you enough. I think what, in addition to data gaps, it's sort of reflecting back on what we started the conversation with around values. So what is important that you want to make sure that we're taking into consideration, and we want you to map that. So if you hike somewhere and you know a lot of people hike there and it's important to your community, please map that. We have that, but so hearing that from you all, that has significance. And also if there are areas where you're concerned about either erosion, flooding, et cetera, please map that as well. So hopefully so I will talk about the exercise in more detail, but that's kind of what we're trying to get out is this is sort of at a high level, 10,000 feet. This is getting down into look at the map and tell us where there are things you've seen or heard that are either important or where there are areas of concern. And I will talk more about what the actual exercise is if you have questions about it.
Forgive the criticism, but what in God's name made you think you could cover all this material in 2 hours? I mean...
Yeah, it's good to be here. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, this is the first meeting, right? So I think the next meeting will probably be 3 hours, right? But I think that this is, you don't know until you have the meeting where we are in terms of our level of understanding. I think the questions you're asking are good questions, and my sort of what I did as we were going through it is say, well, look, we got to answer these questions. I did not want to
No, and I really appreciate that, because this is a really thoughtful group. And,
absolutely.
You know.
Yeah. Your point's noted, though. This is a lot of information. We recognize that. We want to make sure you're all up to speed, and so we appreciate your patience as we're trying to.
The agenda was almost the same for the technical working group, but they finished 10 minutes early. But they've been working face to face a lot. I think this is the first time this group has met. And
the technical work group, that was their first meeting too. But they do it for a living every day, right? Sure. Okay. So. Okay. Well, why don't before you leave, let me describe the exercise just so you understand what we're doing. Do folks have other questions before I explain the exercise? And before I do that, are folks generally comfortable with a group going till 8:45 so we can do this exercise this evening? Okay. So any other questions before I explain the exercise?
I do. Actually, you guys have had months to go through all this stuff and look at it, and then we're supposed to come up with this in 20 minutes. And it seems a little rushed. I mean, we might want to ask for input from,
Okay. So noted. Let's do the exercise and let's talk about next steps. But I think that's something we can revisit. Okay? Mm-hmm.
So the sea level rise looking 2050 and 2100, it's a more progressive impact, but climate change, right, for example, impact or things. So I just wanted to understand, as I review the maps, what are we talking in terms of storm flooding, right?
Yeah.
So to be consistent, okay.
I'm good at yelling too. To be consistent with the county study and the general approach to hazards and hazard planning, we're looking at the 100-year recurring storm. So the storm that has a annual chance of 1% of occurring, typically occur every 100 years, and so those are the storm scenarios that we're modeling or we're using from the hazard maps to assess coastal flooding.
Okay. Again, so a 100-year storm is the worst case, right? That to plan citywide, but I think in recent times we've seen maybe a 5-year or 10-year storm, right? So how is the city adapted or has mitigation measures that we can sustain a 10-year storm, which might be a more near-term climate change impact?
We're not explicitly looking at the 10-year storm, but I know that the Department of Public Works is actively managing storm events, and they deploy temporary portable pump stations to help alleviate the flooding potential for West Sharp Park, for example, and those I know that there's ongoing efforts to address the more regular flooding events. But this study is focusing on looking at the regular high tide as one indicator of a daily frequent level of inundation and impact, in addition to that storm case.
Okay, so let me explain the exercise in a little bit more detail. So the study area is organized into 3 sections. So starting with Fairmont to Manor, to Sharp Park to Rockaway to Lindemar. And just to make sure it's clear, the 3 maps for each section, what the data they show is a little different, but it's the same geographic area. So what we're asking you, is that clear? Okay. Okay, so here's what we're asking for. We're asking for you to help map sort of important high-use areas or areas of concern where there, this could be things you mentioned earlier, actually show us on the map, or other things that are important to consider, other assets that are important to Pacifica to take into consideration. So what we'll ask you to do is take a little sticky note. That's the map there. Put it on the map with your initials and a number, so number them. So my initials are BLG. I'd start there with BLG number 1, and I'd say this area erodes, or this area floods under certain, every year this section of Highway 1 floods, and I'm concerned about that. Yes. Yes, indeed.
You don't want the sticky on the map, though. You want it adjacent?
No, we want it on the map, and I think
right in the spot, right in the
yeah,
spot.
put it on the spot, or put an arrow there, if you will. So that's both assets and areas of concern, and just you can put a little note of what it is, and what the form is for is there's a corresponding sheet here where you just put, if I had the 1 here, I'd put a 1 here, and then you can describe it in more detail. So if you want to get into a little bit more detail of what you're talking about, put it on this sheet, and then you'll hand in this sheet at the end of the meeting today. So hopefully that helps. When you'll have access to the maps, you can take a look at the maps, you have the sheet, so you can send that in to us, if that makes sense. So we're going to give you about 15 minutes to do this, and I think let's see how much information we get. We can talk about potential opportunities to do this again, but again, we can't stay here forever tonight. So let's do it. This is sort of a first cut. Does anyone have any questions before we let you go? It's sort of roam around. Yes? They're going to do that after this, if there's interest and there's time. But we want to do this focused with the work group members for now. Okay?
These maps are on the website, too, the city's website?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
They're on. Okay, so there are, hold on.
Those are all the appendices that there's too much to print.
There's sticky notes here. You guys are welcome to, the colors do not have significance. So any questions before you get started? So it's assets, areas of concern. If you have plans that are useful, please identify those too. Here you go. We're going to take about 15 minutes. Yep. You'll have the time to talk more once we wrap up here.
Get in there, everybody's in the way.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, and I'm going to try to do this quickly, is, again, folks and members of the public, if you folks could find your seats as well, we'd appreciate it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is try to go through these comments. Thank you. I'm going to try to go through these comments briskly to make sure that we understand them. And my hope is that if you have more detailed comments, you're using the sheet here and that you give us that sheet so we have it. But I do want to make sure that folks can just get a flavor for some of the comments that were submitted, recognizing that you did not have a lot of time for this, and we're going to ask you in next steps to give us more detailed feedback, but this is just sort of like a first take. So with that in mind, so for section 1, Fairmont, a couple comments that I'm seeing, and I'll do my best to understand who the initials are. So CA would be, oh, back there. Hello, Cindy, you're not in your seat. Because I'm in your way. Sorry. Taubin's Folly photographic spot. And then it's a man-made historic spot. Okay. And then GGNRA, Muscle Rock Trails, and parking trail access. Moving along here, I don't necessarily see initials on all these. So MG, okay. Muscle Rock, so we see that twice. And then we have hang gliders off of TB. Oh, okay, you guys have very similar writing. Oh, okay. So during rains, this area floods. Who's this? Okay. No, that's fine. Okay. Yeah, and if it's already mapped, that's fine. I think it's helpful for us to understand what you all are observing or what you're finding to be important. Okay, so that's section 1. Okay, section 2, hang gliding again. Economic center in the manor. Yep. And the bluff as a gateway to Pacifica. Right. Okay. And then this looks like your handwriting, Peter. Structures that are hanging over the edge of the bluff.
Yeah, there's a couple structures there that, there's one house that burnt, that the foundation of the house is hanging over the bluff. And then there's, if you walk farther down, there's some concrete structures that are hanging over the bluff. There's actually concrete that has fallen from that part of the cliff down to the beach.
Right. Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay, a couple half sticky notes. Very economical. This is an environmentalist in our midst. So there's one comment from Julie as additional trailhead for Milagro Ridge Trail. Right. There are two trailheads there. Okay, and then. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so I see a lot around Sharp Park. So an economic asset is the old WWTP. Help me with that. Oh, okay.
This building and beyond.
Okay, got it. Okay. Surfing and fishing. So that is near here as well. Potential plover habitat beach. JK? Okay. Can your microphone, please?
Even though they may not have a breeding population, if it's a potential habitat, that deserves some notice. I don't know how you're going to handle that really, but.
Okay. All right, thank you. So RM flooding from 2 watersheds? RM?
You got the bright
Microphone?
Mike?
That microphone. Please use your microphone.
microphone.
I know your name's Ron.
Micro world. Okay. Anyway, yeah, Ron Makel. I have 2 issues. There's 2 watersheds that really compound the flooding in the Sharp Park, the golf course area, and along Lakeside Drive there. And one is the Brighton Creek watershed, which is a big watershed between Talbot and Gypsy Hill. Fortunately, it's all developed, so there's a lot of non-pervious surface there, and tons of water comes through there, and it gets all backs up right in the pipes that go under the Lakeside Drive and then go into the golf course. And then, of course, Sharp Park, the park itself is over 400 acres, and the headwaters to Salada Creek, which is the creek that flows through Sharp Park, is up close to Sweeney Ridge. So that's a massive watershed. So you got a lot of water comes out of there when it rains. And so at any rate, that watershed and the Brighton Creek watershed, by the way, Brighton Creek historically used to flow directly to the ocean, and then it got diverted. But at any rate, those 2 watersheds compound the flooding in addition to some wave surge. So I just want to point that out. So thanks.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, moving along here, Sharp Park Golf Course. The berm trail. So this is Julie again. Sometimes you use full sticky notes and other times you use halves. So trailhead at, this is hard to read, sorry. It's a neighborhood trailhead here, is that right, Julie? Morey Point, okay, thank you. And then another comment around Morey Point, maybe this is a different access point for the same trail, is that right? Over here? Yeah. So, got it. Okay. And then another Morey trail comment. So we're certainly hearing that from a couple folks. Okay, so these are on, there might be overlap here, but I'm just doing one map at a time. Historic District, Palmetto Avenue, so home of the Pacific Coast Fog Fest. SC.
That's me, sorry, I just put
that's
my
fine.
comment.
Do you want to?
Yeah, tell me what number it is.
Number 5.
Number 5, so what data is being used to consider life of new and current projects, and what's the cost-benefit ratio of that?
Okay, and do you want to give us number 8?
Number 8, what is current level of environmental asset loss, including sands on beach? So do we have an estimate, for example, of the beach right now in Sharp Park, because of the levee, how much sand we're actually losing, have already lost, how much more we're going to be losing in the near term, and then overall, if we fortify that area, I understand that the sand is all going to be gone. So we need to look at that assessment as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you. The golf course again as a protective structure. MG number 4. Okay, thank you. So a couple things going on in this area. And then species habitat. So that's you, Gordon. Good.
I see it on the Lindemar map where you designated frog and I think snake habitat, but it's well documented through all kinds of litigation that those species exist there.
Okay, all right, thank you. So just wrapping up on this section here, promenade structure not maintained, need to reuse it? Raise it, I'm sorry, thank you. The gap at Clarendon and Levee Promenade is too low to protect neighborhood. Okay. The lake and the golf course is too shallow and in the winter it always floods. Okay, sorry, this one's not sticky. And then finally, WSP and Fairway Protective Levee. So that's an asset that you're pointing at. This one, is that you? Sure, WSP and Fairway Park Protective Levee. Okay, okay. And then, excuse me? Okay, thank you. Sam, number 4?
Number 4, what is the cost to environmental assets when we build the sea level rise protection structures?
Okay, thank you. And then finally here, the wetland and golf course hazard mitigation.
There's like a little wetland area. I was under the assumption, but it could just be a pond, but that could be a huge tool for mitigation.
Sure could be.
Okay, let's move on to Rockaway. Sam, you had number 2 and number 3 here.
Number 2, how do we assess the vulnerability of Highway 1? So we potentially there, especially along the Clara Parkway there, it's basically showing the erosion of the water potentially going all the way up to the highway. I don't think that today, I don't remember seeing at the 2 o'clock meeting, there was somebody from Caltrans. Was there?
No.
Should we be maybe considering bringing them into the mix?
Okay, so they're invited, they just didn't attend. So, but your point's noted that we want to make sure.
Still upset.
What's that?
What was the next one?
Number 3.
Number 3. See, lack of data for potential restoration of historical wildlife corridors along Highway 1. So if we look at specifically there along some of those points, Caltrans has not really been doing its due diligence of some of the restoration around the wildlife corridor. So if you look at Maury Point, where we had a slide there before, we also have a lot of animals, a lot of deer. I'm not even sure we're taking, and every animal, I mean, they're just getting crushed going across there because it's a historical wildlife corridor. But the same can be said in some areas of Rockaway Beach, and then also even down into the San Pedro Creek area. I mean, sometimes I see deer on the beach going down and get water, especially during the summer months.
Thank you. And was that number 3 or was that number 2?
That was number 3, sorry.
Okay, thank you. TB, number 5? Is that?
The quarry has an accessible trail.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, let's go to LB. And this is I'm not sure what this is precisely, but could the city purchase this, keep open for a barrier? Okay.
I don't know if I'm reading the map right, but I was thinking, I remember in the past, we were voting on something for, I think it was that land to be purchased and have something built there, but I was thinking if the city has funds or if they can get grants to maybe purchase that land as a barrier, but yeah.
Useful barriers, was you saying?
Quarry.
The quarry.
Okay, LL Trail beach access?
Oh, yeah, that's me. Where is it? Rockaway, the north part of Rockaway, we have basically 2 parts.
Hey, Ron.
Yeah, here we go again. Yeah, Rockaway there has 2 beaches to it, south, which is the better of the 2. But the northern part I was really concerned about because the coastal trail as it comes along in front of just north of the Moonraker restaurant, it's a concrete path. And that had been over the years, this year, even recently, within days, we had almost a foot of sand. It just, the water, the waves are just, high tides are washing sand up over the coastal trail because it's just within feet of the armoring issue there. And a lot of the armoring boulders are being pulled down. And then also there used to be a suitable access to that beach, but because of the erosion from the waves and the moving of the boulders, the armoring boulders, the little walkway that used to provide access down to that beach is really not there, and it's actually a hazard because it gets slippery when it's muddy and clay, and it's really a bad access to that beach, and a lot of it has to do with the tidal surges and stuff like that. So I just wanted to point that out. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron. Here I see surfing in a viewpoint. Okay, and then Sam, number 6.
Number 6. What current open space areas can we use for flood mitigation? And there I have, so again, if we have current assets that we want to protect, there's current places that aren't developed yet, obviously, and I think that's directly referencing, I can't see the map from here, but the quarry. If we start building in there, obviously that flood water from any new building is going to have to go somewhere. If we keep it open, that's the areas that we can continue to use to mitigate any flooding. And that actually comes directly out of the National Resource Agency as well, so the Reducing Climate Risk document that was part of the sources that you guys referenced. That applies again to any other open space areas, like if you look down and Pedro Point, the 5 acres there, and the vulnerability that we're talking about that area as well.
Okay, thank you. So a couple comments about the quarry then, that both folks use it now and it could have future uses to help sort of address some of the potential risks that are coming.
Wetland, really.
LB, construction. So we're moving on to our final section, Lindemar, Pedro Point. LB, construction at Parks Building. Okay. Sorry.
So that comment was addressing the current construction that's happening. I believe it's the Parks building there in Lindemar. I believe it's my understanding that they're building its overflow for sewage, and that's highlighted as a danger zone. So I'm bringing it up as a concern.
Okay. So a viewpoint down here, that's Pedro Point, is that right? Number 6, TB.
Oh, just that, that was just on the whole boulevard, that it floods.
Okay, thank you. And then Sam, number one
Oh,
here.
Lindemar Boulevard.
Number one, so that goes back to my earlier comment. So if we're talking about, we're using the sea level rise level of 5.7 feet, it could potentially underestimate flooding, which will affect one, approval of potential approval of new development. 2, cost of protecting our current assets. 3, adequacy of protection of options for sea level rise. And then 4, it also the effects on our environmental assets.
Thank you. Okay, so surfing at Lindemar Beach, biking and running trails. This is along Lindemar as well. And also spring flowers along the coastline. And then a note on the San Pedro Creek Trail that there's wildlife, EOR. Oh, that's your initials.
There's wildlife, there's a creek there, walking, biking, and people just enjoying that trail. A lot of people use it.
Okay, thank you. So LB. Okay, a couple here. Work with the school to update their infrastructure update and create. Infrastructure adaptability plan. Storage unit concerns, wildlife concerns along near Lindemar Trail. A trail concern along Lindemar Beach, and then the parking lot, public restrooms, and permeable surfaces. I'm going to go through these and ask you if you want to add. Gas stations, potential plan to relocate. Businesses, requirements to adapt, and adapting to floods along the river as sea level rises. So a lot of good comments there if you want to add to it at all.
Okay, so I have a lot of comments. I guess as far as the beach goes, there is a trail that runs along that beach and over the hill, and I know there is some wildlife there. I think they were doing something to help protect the wildlife, but my concerns would be whether we can safely raise that land, or how do we protect that further. Also, there is a public restroom at that beach that I'd be concerned about. And then as far as the school, there's the Cabrillo School, as well as those commercial spaces, the Lindemar Shopping Center. I guess I'm curious as to whether the city is going to work with the school or with those businesses to help them adapt to sea level rise, if they have any plans, or how they're going to be involved in this LCP. And I can't remember. Oh, there's a gas station. I don't know how we would deal with that, if we can relocate it. I'm not sure. And then I think, oh yeah, I also addressed there's a river, I forget, or it's a creek. San Pedro Creek, thank you. And how we would deal with flooding. Yep.
Alrighty, so Sam, to wrap it up here, we have number 7, number 9, and number 10.
Okay, so number 7, how are we considering hazard avoidance for new development versus existing infrastructure? So according to the NRA document, we should be avoiding new building in some of these, in the hazard areas. Did you say number 9? Yeah, and number 9?
Yes, number 9.
Specifically, because I live there, so I know this, the Pacific Institute 2100 flooding map is not correct in Pedro Point. Flooding is much higher actually there than what you guys are demonstrating in that map. And then number 10, for the fishermen, that we get a lot of folks fishing along there. I think you can, I see the game warden going down there a lot, so if you contact the game wardens, they should be able to get you numbers of maybe how many license checks they do on a monthly basis or what have you. And then you can also go to the two, I know of two, of the fishing stores, the bait and tackle stores here on Palmetto Avenue. They could tell you how many fishing licenses they are purchased from them as well on an annual basis.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay. Thank you. All right. Okay, so thank you for these comments. These are really helpful. I want to acknowledge that, you know, it's a relatively brief amount of time, and I'm sure there are other things that you'll want to take a closer look at these maps. You'll want to talk to folks in your community, ask them for their input, and part of the process is the public workshop. So we're going to the idea is to have a similar kind of conversation with the broader community around what are the areas of concern, what are the assets that are important to them, to make sure that we're tracking what's important to the community. Now, a comment that was brought up to me that I think is a pretty good one is that some of this information is already mapped and included, so it's not necessarily, hold on one sec, it's not necessarily we're filling in all gaps, but I still think just the conversation around getting folks around the maps, getting them familiar with the data that's on there, and then having conversations around what's important to the community, part of that is we just sort of have to have the process and see where it goes. And hopefully folks are comfortable with that. Question?
Just a comment, just not having ever done this before, I felt like I didn't have enough time to get to all the maps. In fact, I didn't get to all the maps, so just, yeah.
That's a very fair comment. So let's talk about next steps. So a lot of the information that we presented today, and we recognize there's a lot of information, is included in the draft vulnerability assessment document. So if we're talking about homework, that is your homework, is to look at that document and spend some time with it. So print it out, just big cup of coffee, and just go through it, thumb it, write notes, questions, etc. A lot of the information that we put in the slides is captured in that document to help understand how this process works. Is that fair, James? So I think that's just gonna help bring you up to speed a little bit more. And while you're doing that, my invitation to you is we can send you more versions of this sheet. Then go back and look at the maps again and send us more comments. So we are going to continue to ask for your comments around these questions. And so this is, I want to give this is not the only bite at the apple. This is the first bite at the apple. But from my perspective, if you can spend some time with that document, it'll give you a little bit more context. And then the next round of input you have might come from a little bit of a different perspective. So Gordon, do you have a question?
So yeah, to the communication points earlier about how we share this information amongst ourselves, it was suggested that we funnel things to Bonnie, perhaps. Yes. So is it, should we can send that to Bonnie. She would send each individual one to us all on a global list? Or how would you suggest that we see what everybody else is bringing forward as comments and questions?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I'd say where we are now is let's make sure that we get all your information to Bonnie for starters. And then I think the next time we get together, we'll find the best way to compile it so you all have access to it. So what's the input that's come from this group? I think the hope is that we can aggregate it, James, and bring it together into one place. And then you all have the opportunity to look at that. So whether that happens in the next meeting or whether we're able to do that in between meetings and send it out to you, I think that's still to be determined.
I would suggest should be before the next meeting, so we have time to digest that.
Okay.
It'll make better use of our time at that meeting.
Okay. Yeah, that's a fair comment. Okay. Okay. So in terms of next steps, again, an invitation to look through the document. Send us more input after you look through the document. If you have questions, I think, Bonnie, we can send those to you, right? And we just we'll do our best to get those questions answered. If we think the answers to the questions would be the benefit of other folks, we can share the answers too.
Well, so to be totally transparent, you wouldn't edit. You would not choose what you think is relevant to everybody.
Right. Well, yeah, we're aggregating again. So we're sharing the list of...
Sharing the complete comments.
gather them in groups and then?
Yes, I just don't want them selectively identified.
No, that wasn't suggesting that. Okay. Okay, so again, public meeting on the 13th, I believe that's noticed on the website. So again, if you tell your neighbor, tell your friends, tell your family, we do want to make sure there's a strong turnout for that. And then I think what we'll be talking about as a team moving forward is we're certainly sensitive to the comment that this is a lot of information. You folks want to make sure that you have an opportunity to get up to speed and also to provide input. So I think that's something we're going to be talking about how we can best address that request, which I think is a very fair one. So I think more to come on that.
To be those ambassadors, can you identify to us, and perhaps the community at large, how that will be structured, that session? I don't want to just tell my friends and family to show up and
how the workshop will be structured.
How the workshop will be structured so that they community input.
Yeah, I don't think we've planned that quite yet, but the idea is to have some sort of a process where we give them an overview, and I think the overview might be a little bit more
abbreviated version.
Well, a little more palatable to the public and abbreviated, and also an opportunity to get folks around maps to share their input. So I think it will have a similar kind of flow to this meeting, but I think it'll be translated a little differently, I think, if that makes sense. But we want...
So it'll be similar to what we've just done?
Somewhat similar.
Except in public will...
Yeah.
That's the type of input that you wish to receive?
At this part in the process, yes. Okay.
In the stakeholder engagement plan, you said that you would be reaching out to targeted stakeholders. Who is an example of a targeted stakeholder group?
So a targeted stakeholder could be a specific group that has an interest in this project, and I don't think we've necessarily identified which group that is or when that would happen, but it's sort of a tool in the toolbox, if you will. If that seems to be appropriate, then that's just acknowledging that may happen. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for staying late, and my apologies that we went a little bit over time. But this has been very helpful for us. Hopefully it's been helpful for you, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. So thank you again, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Okay.
Away we go.
It helps develop a greater sense of place. These are pretty real educational, how much they can be aggravating.
One thing I forgot, for members of the public, if you are interested, you're certainly invited to grab some sticky notes and write up comments and have a corresponding sheet. We'll stay around if you want to do that. You certainly are more than welcome to do that. For the work group members, please give us your sheets, because we're going to use those. Well, if you...